As I said, I'm Quinn Conklin, as Cliff has said. Our job here as Cliff's lab is to give you a little flavor of what each of us has been doing and the kinds of things we've been thinking about that prompted this meeting. And so what I'm going to be talking about is a project we've called Contemplative Coping during COVID-19. And I will unpack this image just a touch, but we'll come back to that in a minute. First, I want to acknowledge the team of amazing human beings that have been conducting this work and recognize that we actually have more of us in the room today than we've ever had in person together throughout the 3 years of doing this work. I also want to just pause for a moment and say how special this day is for me to have many of my mentors in the room and, as I said, this amazing team, but I also have my partner in the back here and family on Zoom, so this is just a really sweet and special day for me. I want to acknowledge the funders. Oh, I made them cry already. I want to acknowledge our funders, the Mind and Life Institute, the Yoga Science Foundation, the Fetzer Institute, and many other donors who made this project possible. And then I want to bring us back to the early days of the pandemic when we just sort of learned what was happening and there was a lot of uncertainty. I was poised to begin my dissertation study that I had been planning for however many years at that point, and then we got the lockdown orders in California and went, oh, well, that's really not going to work. And so what can we do instead? And so we took this early career award from the Mind and Life Institute, a Varela grant, and generated a ton of more funding to support a big expansion and pivoting of this project to investigate whether or not contemplative practices and training would help people cope with the various uncertainties and stressors of the pandemic. So our central question here is, does meditation and contemplative training help people cope? And this image encapsulates a lot of those early days. So we were being told to stay 6 feet away from one another, to not touch our face, how often and how long we should be washing our hands. These are these giant COVID viruses floating around. We were inundated with a lot of media, and there was a lot of uncertainty. If you remember the asymptomatic transfer, we didn't know how long any of this was going to be going on. But in this bottom corner, we have the idea that contemplative and restorative practices might help us through this. And from the beginning, we didn't know all the ways in which this would be true, but we did know that this was going to affect people differently. And so we wanted to really build a comprehensive battery of questionnaires and design a holistic study that would help us capture a lot of information. So what we did was design a longitudinal study that had 4 time points throughout the year. We checked in with people every 4 months, and we gave them a long list of questionnaires. And at the beginning and the end of that 1-year period, we invited people to send us a blood sample so we could measure telomere length. And telomeres are a biomarker related to cellular aging. I won't dive too deeply into those today, but just to give you a little sense of that. And again, I'm not going to unpack all of the things that we measured, but I've put this list up here. These are the many different constructs that we asked people about. So things related to COVID, a long history of their contemplative experience and prior training, mental health and well-being related constructs. In our weekly inventories, we asked people to journal about the stressors and supports that they were experiencing from week to week. And then we also measured things related to their prior adversity history and also constructs that we thought might be affected by contemplative practice, so things like mindfulness or interoception. I again will not unpack the whole timeline here, but on the bottom we have a bit of a timeline of how this project unfolded. And along the top, we have some reminders of some of the events that unfolded that year. And this is really just to show you how quickly the landscape was changing and how there was always something new coming through the news cycle that we were encountering. And I'll pause here for just a moment to say that this was the first study our lab has done that was outside of a retreat context. And so it was a new opportunity for us to try and recruit and reach a diverse national sample. And that was a challenge that we didn't, we learned a lot. We didn't manifest exactly what we wanted to, but we learned a lot along the way. And part of that process was hiring Dr. Camila Majid to help us revise our recruitment and study materials to make them more inclusive and welcoming. I also want to just briefly acknowledge some of the other humans that helped us with that process. There are even more folks than are shown here, but each one of these people had a really loving hand in how this study unfolded and guiding us through this process. So to collect telomeres, can I just get a time check here? I'm realizing that I don't see anything up here. Okay. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to go fast, but we designed a remote blood collection kit that we mailed to participants' homes so they could send us this sample remotely. They FedExed those samples back to us. And I just going to show you here that the main takeaways from these slides are we got 836 applicants, and from that pool, we got 389 people to start our study. Our goal was to have 300 people go through the whole study from beginning to end, but no one had collected blood samples in this particular way with these microtubes that we used, and so we didn't really know how that was going to unfold either. And so of those initial kits, we sent out 334 to participants. There were hiccups along the way with FedEx delaying samples here and there, people who couldn't collect a sample from their finger pricks. And this ended up with 265 usable samples from our baseline collection. And then from our 1 year, we started off with 234 folks getting the kits and 179 usable samples. And the lovely news there was that every sample that we did get that had sufficient volume also had really good DNA integrity. And so that's as far as we got in terms of analyzing that data so far. I will be diving into it. But we were delighted to discover that the DNA integrity was good, even though these were traveling through hot temperatures and long delays and various other issues. So now I am going to invite you to play along here if you would like, and I will probably be very brief, but another aspect of what we are trying to do is make the results of our study more accessible to people outside of academia and to disseminate those findings in ways other than traditional journal articles. So my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Percorny, has really been leading these efforts, and she has developed a Shiny app to present a lot of our data. She is actively building this, so it changes every day, and we get new and exciting things added. One of the things we're doing is providing descriptions of each of the measures that we took, and a lot of this is going to be about visualizing the data from different angles, especially because this was a complex design with a whole lot of different variables changing throughout. We want to people to really be able to explore the different variability. So what I'm showing you here is changes in perceived stress. And the punchline of this image is that we had as many people going up as going down from time point to time point. So there's a lot of individual differences here to think about. And then the alluvial diagram here is showing you that the majority of folks in our study had low perceived stress, but we had people all across the spectrum, and that people kind of floated up and down throughout the year-long period. So this gives us a lot of motivation to look at those individual differences and what was really going on for people at each of those time points. You will also be able to explore relationships between different variables in this app. And so what we've got here is meditation years against perceived stress. And it's a small correlation, but we do see that the more experience people had with meditating even prior to the study, the lower their perceived stress scores. And that was true even when we account for age. And I will probably leave it there to let you explore the different features, but a lot of what you can do here is add different demographic categories and see different breakdowns. You can look across the different time points. We've got correlation matrices to look at the interrelationships between different variables, and we will keep adding to this as we learn more and more. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brandon King.
Okay, hello, welcome. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of our work in the space of compassion and actually more specifically engagement with suffering. This is a common thread in many, maybe most, maybe all contemplative traditions. How do we encounter suffering to transform it into compassion and to wisely engage with it? And even stepping back, how can we come to register the suffering of others so that we notice it, and then what can we do, and how does that land in our attention and in our awareness and in our body states? So I'm going to be talking about a study we did a number of years ago in an intensive retreat setting. So how many people here have been on a retreat? Okay, that's a lot of people. So so typically in a retreat, people will go to a space. This is a lodge at Shambhala Mountain Center in Colorado, where we did a study, and 30 individuals came and lived in this hall and practiced meditation for 3 months, and they practiced all day, every day. And so why study a retreat? One of the reasons is that, well, there's a lot of meditation, and so if we're interested in the effects of meditation on something like engagement with suffering, you have a lot more meditation. But there's a lot of other things going on retreats. A lot of other changes that support this practice. This is the natural setting where they were at. We can think about what is the role of nature, what is the role of or the relationship between a student and a teacher, the social setting, the support, the changes in daily routines, and all these things. And what's the role of motivation that people bring to their practice, they bring on retreat? This is the great stupa of Dharmakaya, which sits on a hill that you can hike up to from the retreat center and practice and sit in a hall with this great statue. And so it just goes to think about when we think about how meditation might influence compassionate responses, we can think about the meditation practices themselves, but we can also think about all these other factors and how they support each other. So the first question I ask is, can 3 months of intensive meditation in a retreat environment alter motivational engagement with human suffering? And by this I mean, what happens if we simply present, in this case, images of suffering to people? And what happens in their body? What happens in their attention? So I'm going to jump right to the data just so we can see what happens. So we had 2 groups, a control group and a retreat group. They were randomly assigned to these groups, 30 people in each group. The retreat participants practiced at the retreat center for 3 months, and the control participants lived at home during this time, and they continued their normal daily routines, including their meditation practice. We were interested in 2 conditions. So people did an experiment where they saw emotional images. Each image was presented for 6 seconds, and there were 2 main kinds of images, threat images and suffering images. And what we did is we measured people's heart rate while they watched these images. And so this is what's called an orienting response. This is a deceleration in heart rate that happens when you see emotional stimuli. And the more strong, the lower this response gets, the more motivationally salient the images are. Meaning the more they activate our emotion systems, the more they activate our cognition, our attention, our behavior. So this is the control group, and you can see a very nice, strong response to threat. If we compare this to suffering, what we see also is another orienting response, but it's lower. It's lower than threat. And this is because things that represent suffering in others, like distress, pain, and I'll show some examples of these in a minute, tend to be less salient to us than threats to ourself, threats to our own direct survival. And so if you look at the retreat group for threat, we can see that there's really no difference there for the controls. But if we look at suffering, what we observed was this increase in the deceleration in the orienting response to suffering, an increase from pre to post assessment in the retreat group, suggesting to us that suffering was more salient to them, more important to them, maybe more in line with their values, their ongoing cognition. And you can see that this line actually goes down about to the level where threat was before training. And so it's also important to note that in this experiment, people were just passively viewing the images. There were no instructions to meditate, to regulate themselves in any way. So this is really a trait dispositional change in this aspect. Okay, so how can we systematically investigate motivational responses to suffering? What we did is took a step back with these results that we found promising, and we decided to create a set of stimuli that would help us to investigate this space. And so I'm going to show various emotional stimuli. Some might be a little bit powerful, so I just wanted to warn everyone about that. And so what we did is we created a thematic affective picture set, and these are some of the images. And this set has 5 different content categories, and we really wanted to create a research tool that people can use to dissociate responses to suffering from responses to threat. So there's these content categories of threat, suffering, and what we're calling harm, and I'll show you some examples of these, and as well as positive images. The set is thematically organized because we really wanted to cover a diversity of kinds of suffering, of kinds of interpersonal conflict. And it's informed by diversity in many senses of the word, diversity of experiences of suffering, human beings, backgrounds, ages, body types, all these kind of things. So these are some images of threat, just to give you an idea. So they represent danger to yourself, and there's no representation of someone suffering. So they're supposed to evoke fear, anxiety, and things like that. These are some examples of human suffering, various themes. So you can see a theme of natural disasters, a theme of a person experiencing joblessness or homelessness, grief and mourning. And so each of these themes, and there are 18 themes in total, has a number of pictures that represent these diverse aspects. And so here are pictures of interpersonal conflict or harm that really we're trying to capture both aspects of threat and aspects of suffering together in images. And again, they were taken from various diverse kinds of intergroup conflict and harm. And then we also have some nice positive pictures. So we weren't just showing people these negatives. And there's 2 kinds, social, which involve social people or animals or interactions, and non-social scenes. So first thing we did with this set is to ask what characterizes individual differences in motivational engagement with suffering. And so we did an experiment where we asked about 250 university students to rate this set of images. And so what they did is they viewed images like this for as long as they needed to form an impression. And then we asked them to rate the images on 4 dimensions. The first 2 dimensions relate to emotional valence, so they're positive or negative feelings, so how pleasant you felt and all the different kinds of pleasant emotion, happy, joy, excitement, enthusiasm, negative feelings, disgust, anger, fear, sadness, any kind of negative feeling. But then we also asked them about the motivational direction of this emotional state. So whether they felt this tendency to approach and engage with the scene depicted in the image, or they had a tendency to avoid or withdraw or want to escape. And so we really wanted to see what is this relationship between negative feelings and approach behavior for human suffering. So these are the data for emotional valence with all of the 5 categories that I showed you. So there's a really nice separation between positive ratings on the right for positive pictures and negative on the left for negative pictures. Negative images of threat and suffering were about equivalent in how unpleasant people found them. Harm was a little more unpleasant, probably because it combines aspects of those 2 other categories. But when we look at whether people are saying they want to avoid or approach the scene, we see a different picture. So the positive images, people tend to want to approach. They tend to want to avoid the negative images. But there's this interesting spread for suffering. And so what this tells us is that people really differ in this mapping between unpleasant states. Everyone sees suffering as negative, as aversive, as something that is unwanted, but not everyone is saying that they want to escape that. Some people are saying that they might approach the scene. And so these are just correlations between the emotional valence and motivational direction. And so there's a strong correlation for the pleasant scenes and for threat, and much lower for suffering. And harm falls in between. So we can ask, okay, so about 1/3 of people said they would rated approach stronger than avoid for suffering. So what can account for this? What might be going on here on an individual level? So we looked at individual differences in empathy, particularly a facet of empathy called empathic concern, which has to do with having other-oriented concern and attention towards the suffering of others, guided by a motivation to want to reduce their suffering. It's strongly related to compassion. And so interestingly, we didn't predict this, but what we found for threat is that the people higher in empathic concern rated threat as more negative, and they also rated threat as more avoidant. They would want to avoid it more. For suffering, we see an opposite pattern. People who are higher in empathic concern rate suffering as more negative, as more unpleasant. But they say they want to approach it. They're more likely to say they want to approach it. And for harm, what we see, again, more negative, the more empathy you have, or the more trait empathic concern. And the correlation is kind of in the middle between the 2 for motivational direction. So really the takeaway here is that for having this quality of compassion and empathic concern, really suffering is negative, and it's more negative to you. So it's registering. So it needs to register. It needs to really be motivationally salient. And yet you're saying you might approach the situation, presumably to address the situation to reduce suffering in others. So we're really interested now in this idea of what might pull people to want to approach human suffering. So we can think about what other factors might account for this tendency. And we're doing some work to ask now, can this tendency be trained, which you'll hear about in a moment. And I think another interesting question is, what is the experiential nature of this shift? What does it mean to feel this aversion and yet want to approach? How does this develop temporally? How does it develop in body state and things like that? So that's it. Thank you.
Hello, so my name is Alea, and I am the 3rd postdoc in Cliff's lab. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we are taking these questions that Brandon just talked with you about and trying to move them out of the lab and into the world, and some of the opportunities and challenges we've run into while doing that. So the Pathways project was originally designed to be a hardcore lab study of the motivational salience of suffering, building on the heart rate findings from Brandon's dissertation that you saw from the retreat study. We plan to look at changes in visual attention and physiological responding two images of suffering and how these changed with short-term, so 8-week contemplative training. We're going to look at two different trainings, one that has an explicit focus on compassion, compassion cultivation training, and one that has a less explicit, although it's still present there, so more implicit focus on compassion, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Our idea was that both of these interventions should ultimately lead to increases in compassionate responding, but they should do so through different attentional and regulatory pathways, hence the name. But the same week that we finished building our lab at the Center for Mind and Brain here at UC Davis, the COVID lockdowns began in California. So we pivoted. Rather than just selecting images for our own study, we stopped and took the time to validate and curate this beautiful picture set that Brandon just told you about that could really be a resource for the whole research community. So that was one pivot we made that we could do. In the meantime, we shifted a lot of focus and resources to the contemplative coping during COVID study that Quinn just told you about, since that was very timely. I finished my dissertation, because this was not actually what my dissertation was on, that was cool. And as it became more and more clear that this wasn't going to be a 2-week thing or a 2-month thing or even potentially a 2-year thing, we stopped and started asking ourselves some, I think, really important questions. One was, do we actually need to bring people into the lab to collect high quality data? And two, if the purpose of training is to integrate practice into life, can we just measure people in the flow of their lives? So, one of the first things we needed to establish to ask these questions was, how does online meditation training compare to in-person? We had originally planned this study to be a study of people taking these courses, CCT and MBSR, in person in this area where they could come to our lab at Davis. And I know Paul Condon, who will speak to you later, also has some, I don't know if he's presenting it today, but has some data on in-person versus online or app-based trainings. So we went and asked teachers to start about their perceptions of the efficacy of different trainings, and we owe a deep amount of gratitude to Erica Rosenberg, who is in the audience, and John Kabat-Zinn, who I believe is tuning in online, who helped connect us with a multitude of teachers to answer our questions. So this is data from about 275 teachers who have taught classes online and in person for mindfulness-based interventions and compassion-based interventions. And so overall, for efficacy, they reported that online was slightly less effective. It is a significant difference, but if the midpoint here is of equal quality at 3, we're actually not that far off in terms of teachers' perceived efficacy of online versus in-person training. And then we also asked them, well, okay, do you think that online compared to in-person training dilutes the efficacy or dilutes the strength of training? And they said, yeah, a little. And we said, okay, does it strengthen aspects of training? And they said, yeah, a little. And interestingly, these are not correlated. So it's not that some people saying, oh yeah, it dilutes it a lot and it doesn't strengthen it at all, right? Generally, people are saying it does both. And we have some qualitative data on what aspects those are that we haven't gotten a chance to analyze yet, but I actually do have some of that to show you from the student perspective. So as part of the CCC project that Quinn told you about, we asked about the impact of the pandemic and the shift to practicing more in home on people's practice. So we asked, to what degree do you find pandemic-related changes to your practice have improved or strengthened or deepened your practice? And people said somewhere between somewhat and a lot. We asked how much it had weakened their practice or disrupted it. A little to none. So overall, people were actually saying that the shift to being more in their homes had strengthened their practice. There are a lot of other factors here, more time, when you're not commuting, kind of more quiet, maybe more of a need for practice. So we can't say this is exactly an analog to online practice, but it is interesting to see that even not being able to gather in communities, people were saying that their practices were strengthened, or in-person communities. And then this is some qualitative data. It's, I know, a little hard to see, but in people's qualitative responses to what they liked about online practice versus what they did not like about online practice. People really liked accessibility. They really liked, let's see, there's the sense of community, which is interesting. They felt a sense of community online. They disliked the missing in-person presence. Some people said they had no dislikes. There's some really interesting analyses that are being done now, and I should have called them out at the beginning. Savannah Vandenbos, who is in the room, and Jen Percorny, who are the first authors on the manuscript that is in prep on this, where they're doing some cluster analysis to look at how these different factors form different groups within these people that responded. So keep an eye out for that. But basically the takeaway was we can move forward with online training without being concerned that we're losing the core, kind of the essential core of practice. So then comes the question, can we actually collect high quality data from participants' homes? So as I said, we were trying to collect eye tracking and physiological data. There are online eye trackers available. We have been using something called WebGazer that was developed and is open for use from a group at Brown. And this is kind of a walkthrough of what it looks like when you're using this software. So first, it gets kind of a map of your face, as you can see in the purple box there. So the blue dots are it actually mapping my face. And the reason it does this is when you use an in-lab eye tracker, it's looking at your corneal reflection. It has an illuminator for your eye, and that's what it's tracking. This is actually modeling your pupil location and tracking where it thinks your pupil is looking on the screen. You calibrate it, which is in the green box here. So there are dots that move around the screen, and you move your eyes quickly to do that. Learning how to do that well is a task in and of itself. And then you look at pictures, and it tracks where on the screen it thinks you're looking. Now, we were doing an implementation of this in an online delivery platform called Gorilla. They say that you can get down to the quadrant of the screen resolution. And for us, we said, well, that's not good enough for our purposes. So how far can we push this? Can we actually get usable data for the sorts of analyses we want to do by tweaking a few things? So quickly, I'm going to show you the sort of data we're getting out with our tweaks, and then I'll talk about those toward the end. So here is a calibration screen from one participant, one trial. So you can kind of get a sense of within a person at the center, so the squares are where the dots actually were on the screen, and then the circles are the standard deviation of the modeled gaze location, with the dot in the middle being the mean. So not too bad for a single calibration with these tweaks we implemented. And then this is across 5 participants, their average calibration centers compared to where it is. So we actually are getting much better than quadrant of the screen accuracy with some tweaks. Here are some gaze time heat maps, so single participant, and you can see on that image a blue circle. So this was an instructed task where we were testing how well we could actually get people to focus in an area when we knew where they were supposed to be looking. So the instructions were spend 90% of your gaze time in this blue circle. So across a single participant and then across 5 participants. Kind of the distribution we're getting here. So not as clean as ideal, but much better than quadrant. For physiology, we switched to using Empatica watches, and here we're seeing heart rate. And so what you see on the panel on the left is 3 different participants looking at 12 trials of suffering, pleasant, and threat. We see some individual differences in their response patterns, but for every single participant, you can actually differentiate their heart rate responses to these different categories. And then on the right, you're seeing a single participant across multiple different themes of suffering specifically. So we're seeing kind of some spread of those themes. And then skin conductance, what we're seeing up top here in the red is actually a suffering theme of harm, or sorry, not of harm, I think it's of emergencies and like physical pain. So you can actually see kind of the largest response to that. And we're actually getting pretty good skin conductance. So can we do this? Yes. And it takes a lot of tweaks. So To the right there, you see, or I guess to my right, your left, what you see is the box that we have to mail participants with their whole in-lab setup. We can't just have them use their built-in webcam. They need to use a high-quality webcam that we send them. They need to use a ring light to get the lighting accurate. They need to use a chin rest. If you do WebGazer, it just says to put your hands like this, which doesn't work for the sort of data quality we need. So we actually have to have participants set up a whole in-home lab to get the sort of data quality we need, which is doable, but it doesn't work just following the basic instructions of what you could just do, right? You really need a lot of building. And then for the Empatica watch, we found for the heart rate it was great, but it was not collecting skin conductance effectively because you don't really have sweat glands in your wrist. So we hacked it and placed snap electrodes that we then run to the fingers. So yes, and innovation and tweaks are necessary. We are in the process of beginning to pilot this on a larger group while we are collecting some of the data that Brandon was showing you, as well as other measures of common humanity and integration of practice into daily life, in particular, the ability to maintain positive resonance in moments of conflict on these training participants. So we've shifted from we'll do it on everyone to we will do it on a pilot and make sure that we're actually collecting good data. But the feasibility was actually encouraging. So I'm just gonna open this up. I'm not gonna go through all of these of asking ourselves the question of like, what is lost and what is gained in moving to a remote format. Certainly we're losing a degree of precision and nuance in the data. We're losing the sense of in-person connection and the embodiedness. And we're losing a high degree of logistical straightforwardness. This is very messy. But we're gaining a lot of ecological validity, more inclusive and diverse participant groups, broader and different questions that are possible. And so I think this is an interesting conversation to have maybe as a group at the end. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. And quickly, I just want to say thank you to all of our funders that have made this work possible even in the middle of a pandemic. So we're deeply grateful. So thank you, and I want to move to the next panel because we've already gone a little over. So thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. So when Cliff emailed me to give a talk here, I was like, oh no. Oh no. But I can say already from yesterday talking with the other speakers and the organizers who are doing an amazing job, I'm invigorated and excited, and while I don't see all the connections in the world, I have a strong sense that they're there, right? So I'm not gonna be talking about contemplative practice much, but I think I'm learning over the past few days that I'm hitting on a lot of things that I see some beautiful intersection and overlap, and I can't wait to continue conversations based off of what I'm gonna show you today. But what am I gonna show you today, if I'm not talking about contemplative practice directly, is about memory. So at the core of my heart and my research passion is trying to understand memory processes. I always forget this. I'm also a queer scientist. Representation matters, and there's not a lot of us in the field. If anybody wants to talk about it, I am open and available, and it's something I'm very passionate about. Okay, so a lot of memory researchers in the world are obsessed with this question about memory selectivity, right? So why is it that some information falls to the wayside while other information will live with us forever, right? To hours, to days, to months, to years, and what sticks on this? And there's been a lot of questions about like, how does memory selectivity emerge, right? Like, let's find the mechanisms of how it emerges. And my research program takes like a slightly different angle at it by asking the question of why does memory selectivity emerge? And it might seem trivial, but there's something sort of deep about trying to understand the meaning of the memory selectivity when you ask this question. So there's been a huge, enormous amount of research trying to understand some of this why question of memory selectivity. And it's often focused on things like affect and emotion. So if we encounter a snake on a path, that is intrinsically threatening, as Brandon said. Or if we see an adorable puppy in a park, we're gonna remember that because there's something really cute and wonderful about that puppy. Or something surprising or unexpected, that's gonna pop out in memory. And while this work has been amazing and phenomenal, One thing about it is that it's been really focusing on the stimulus itself, right? What are the intrinsic properties of what's happening out in the world that's driving in memory? But everything we see in the world is filtered through our goals and our desires, right? And we have this whole internal landscape that can shape what we're seeing in the world. So an example I give of this is whenever my partner and I go somewhere new, I'm the type of person that is like, oh my God, let's do everything, right? So I might be walking along this dark path back to our hotel, but I'm like, we have to eat there. I need to buy a book there. I need to get this for my mom, right? And I'm just encoding the whole world around me with this sort of like sense of vigor and excitement. My partner, on the other hand, he's the type of person who will look up the crime statistics of wherever we're going. So he is seeing the exact same alleyway and is just saying like, who's around that corner? Like maybe we should walk past it. Maybe we should take another route. What I want to emphasize here is that the exact same stimuli is being presented to us as we move through the world, but the way we're orienting towards those stimuli is going to change sort of the landscapes of what we hold in memory. So in this way, memory is motivated. It's motivated by our internal states. So what this entails is thinking about the lens through which we encode the world. I think this is one of the really interesting areas to connect with contemplative science. So what my research program does, broadly speaking, is we think about the world and then we think about the goal states in which we move through the world. We've been thinking a lot about states of exploration versus states of threat, like the example I just gave you about my partner. We think what this does is that it engages different neuromodulatory systems in the brain when you're in these different states. So in states of exploration, we get activation of the VTA and dopamine, these things that we know have to do with exploration and curiosity and rewards and motivated behavior. But when we're in states of threats, we actually have a very different neurochemical state that's getting embodied in our brain. Things that have to do with stress hormones and amygdala activation and norepinephrine. And what we think happens, and we have some evidence, garnering this up, is that it's going to change sort of the fundamental structure of how we map the world in our brains, where when you're in these exploratory states, you get more relational or integrative representations of the world around you. While you're in states of threat, you get more item-focused representations that are really focused on perceptual and sensory details of the world itself, right? And we're really interested in sort of unpacking this model, and we're going to dive into a little bit of it today. So what I want to talk about today first is to give a little bit of primer of the model that I just showed you about how goal states influence memory in this framework that we're operating in. Then I really want to zoom in on threat and memory and how that might lead to memory fragmentation. And then finally, I'm going to present some new work that I've never presented anywhere yet. So we'll see how it goes on sort of thinking about threat not as this isolated construct, but how it might ebb and flow with curiosity and what impacts that has on memory. So let's sort of jump into the primer. So I showed you this model about threat and exploration. Where did it come from, right? What was the work that we did to do this? I'm doing this thing for any graduate students in the audience where you have 5 years of work presented in one slide, which is either demoralizing or exciting. I'm gonna go with exciting. So what I did in grad school is to embody these states, we looked at sort of incentivizing neutral information, like intrinsically boring, mundane information, and we either incentivized it with a monetary reward to evoke this sense of reward and exploration, or threat of shock, right? And what we did is we looked across a bunch of different types of memories. The first thing we looked at was unitized memory. Like, do you remember this specific item on its own? And when we look at this, both reward and threat were enhancing memory. So it was more than a neutral condition, but it was equivalent across the states. You might walk away thinking, motivation's motivation, it enhances memory, story's done, right? But the story unfolds more when we change the type of memory we're looking at. So in the next study, we wanted to look at sort of item context binding. So we had people navigating through this virtual reality environment akin to a Morris water task where they have to find a hidden platform. And the only way you can do this is if you have a nice, rich relational map of the room around you to help you sort of angle and triangulate and find where those hidden locations are. Now, when we look at this, reward enhanced your memory for those locations, but threat actually impaired it. So think about this for a second. You know that if you can't find this platform, you're going to receive an electrical shock. you are motivated to find that platform, and you are still doing worse on these conditions. It's a state where sort of your intention or motivation to actually do it doesn't translate to forming the type of map that you need in the world. In the third one, we wanted to take a step back to get a little bit more naturalistic. We're often not told, like, I'm going to give you $5 for this piece of information, right? Rather, we find ourselves in states of different motivational valence, and then we encounter information along the way. So in this one, we evoked a sense of either threat or exploration by having them approach or avoid these outcomes. And then we just showed them surprising information while they were in these states. And what we found was that in the reward condition, this enhanced your memory for that surprising information, but when you were in the threat condition, it's like it never happened, right? Your sole focus was on threat and you weren't picking up the information that came along with it. So in these ways, it just sort of really shows that it's not just about the world around us. We really need to think about the filters of motivation that are happening if we really want to understand what's happening to memory. So this was wonderful. I'm a behavior person. I love it. But we also wanted to sort of unpack why this might be emerging. And we went and pivoted to a really beautiful literature, a lot which has been done at Davis by Andy Ionelinis, who's a wonderful, wonderful memory researcher that I'm obsessed with. And what they've shown is that, we have these regions in the brain that we know have to do with memory, right? You take your intro to psych course, they're like, the hippocampus does memory, and this is what you hear. But there's actually more nuance to it. So if you look at the hippocampus itself, it loves doing that relational memory, binding items to context, grabbing these things, making integrative maps of the world around it. But there's another set of regions in the cortical MTL, so this is called the perirhinal cortex and perihippocampal cortex, that really are good at remembering specific things, like just an item or just a scene, but you can't actually bridge them together into a relational map, right? So I could have a person with a hippocampal lesion, and they might be able to say like, oh, I've met you before, right? Or I've been to this restaurant before, but they might really find it challenging to say like, oh, I remember meeting you at that specific restaurant at this time, right? So this started to map onto what we were thinking is happening with exploration and threat, in that one is these rich relational maps, one is sort of focused on individual items, and that's exactly what we saw was a trade-off between these two states, that even though the same surprising information was being presented to people, if you were blind to experimenter instructions and looked at the screen, the world looked the same, right? But when it was embedded in a state of reward, it enhanced processing in the hippocampus, but when it was embedded in a state of threat, it enhanced processes in these cortical medial temporal lobe regions, right? So we're starting to build a neural architecture of why you get these memory differences. Okay, so just as a little summary, despite individuals learning the exact same information, their goal state in the moment can change the representations of that information. And these differences in goal-oriented memory are rooted in engagement of fundamentally different learning systems under threat and exploration. So for some reason, I did all this work in grad school, I was obsessed with threat, and then I just stopped doing it for 6 years. I was working with different advisors that weren't oriented as much on these questions, and then when I started my own lab at Temple, I was like, oh my gosh, I really missed that line of research. And we decided to jump back into it. But as I matured and moved through the world, this question kept on nagging me that I really wanted to dig deeper into memory phenomenology, right? And part of this, I say, is moving from a two-dimensional world to a three-dimensional world, right? Because when you think about the experience of memory, the phenomenology of memory, it's not just like, oh, I recognize that face, oh, no, I don't, right? It is so much more. It is like this living three-dimensional thing. You can think about the structure of it, the form of it, the content of it, right? All these factors sort of are embedded with the memory, and then just sort of our basic cognitive neuroscience techniques were precluding us to really breathe life into understanding what's happening to memory. This is a little abstract, so I'm gonna share an example, and I swear I'm not gonna spend this whole talk making fun of my boyfriend, but it looks like I am. I'm gonna share a moment that happened like 6 months ago that was a mildly traumatic moment for me. I'm fine, I'm all right, I'm not suffering from any PTSD symptoms from it, but it evokes this sense of 2D versus 3D. So I went to go see Everything Everywhere All at Once with a friend, beautiful movie, very violent in terms of inducing goal states, right? So like I'm in some sort of goal state after watching that movie. I'm driving home on a dark road. It's midnight. I stop at a stoplight. I do a thing you're not supposed to do, which is I pulled out my phone and was scrolling through Twitter. And then I hear a noise coming towards my car, somebody screaming. They were in a very altered state in that moment. I then started screaming for them to get away from my car, and then the next thing I know, they had opened the door of my car and were entering my car, right? Which is a severe state of threat. I slam on the gas and drive away, right? There's three things about this experience that I wanted to talk about. One, I have no idea what I was looking at on Twitter, right? Even though that was my goal orientation moment, was to look at the Twitter phone. I don't remember what I was looking at. I'm a nerdy memory researcher, so I was like, "Ooh, that's interesting," right? The other thing is I, immediately called my partner afterwards, and I tried to explain to him what was happening because I was really upset. I get home and he's like, "Oh, so somebody just thought you were a Uber driver?" And I was like, "What? Like, this was the most traumatic thing that's happened to me in a year, and you got from it like a silly incident where somebody thought I was an Uber driver." So something about the way I was communicating this memory was not happening, right? And then the third thing is you hear a lot in the trauma literature about memory reliving and re-experiencing of trauma. And I really get into fights a lot with some trauma researchers for using the word memory sort of to describe this. Because when I thought back on that memory, it wasn't like, oh, and then I was doing this, and then I did this, and then I did this. I could just hear the voice of myself screaming in my ear, right? There was something very different and decontextualized about that memory when I went back to reflect on it, right? And this is what I mean. How do we start to capture these things? Let's make memory more three-dimensional. So to do this, raises a question of a challenging problem because I'm not going to be able to capture all these things if I show individuals pictures one at a time on a screen, right? There has to be something narrative to the event to actually unpack these things that I'm struggling. Autobiographical memory research has nailed this literature, right? Because they can look at real life events, but the struggle with that is you have no idea what's happening during learning, and you can't actually validate what happened during the event. So you're sort of missing some of the rigor that we get from these in-lab studies. So what we needed was a terrifying event that unfolds over time that we had control over. And luckily, 3 blocks from my house, and I have to thank my 2 trainees here, Stephen and Isabel, who did an amazing amount of work on our most recent iteration of this project. It's a lot. It's a haunted house, right? And this haunted house, the same things happen every single night of the haunted house, so we know what's happening, and it is terrifying. Like full set decorations, noises, sounds, smoke, actors jumping out at you, right? But all of this is happening in an order that we can really capture the memory for it. So it sort of gave a perfect opportunity to expand our knowledge of what's happening in these threatening situations. So in the first iteration of this, what we did is we sent individuals to the haunted house. We collected their heart rate while they were in the haunted house. Then a week later, we had them come back to the lab and we said, just tell us everything you can remember from the haunted house, right? The beauty of this haunted house is that it's, for the rodent neuroscientists, it's a 6-arm radial maze. I don't know why it's a 6-arm radial maze, but it was a 6-arm radial maze. But what happens is in each arm of the haunted house is a different theme. So one might be like gore and blood, and the other one's like post-apocalyptic, and the other one's hospitals, right? And what is really nice about this is that we can all have different idiosyncratic fears, right? Clowns might terrify me, but Cliff might be terrified of hospitals. So now we don't need to rely on oh, this is the scarier thing and this is the less scary thing. We can idiosyncratically look at individuals' heart rate to each event and then use that as a way to resolve what's going on in memory. So in general, this did get people's heart rates up and moving. If we just look at a simple comparison of the haunted house versus the lab, there's huge increases in it. And what's important, because heart rate can account for a lot of things like going for a jog, right? The heart rate measures at the within each segment predicted individuals' experienced fear in that segment. So this is capturing something about the idiosyncratic threat in each one of these rooms. Okay, so enough setup. what's going on with their memories, right? So before jumping into data, I just wanted to read one person's to give you a flavor of the memory. This person said, there's a lot of blood everywhere in that room. There was someone with like a saw at one point and a guy holding a saw that wasn't a saw and walking around following people. You get a flavor for it, right? The thing that really popped out to me is that there is this emphasis on sensory and perceptual details, right? It's not like, oh, and I was wearing this sweater, right? Or like, and then I walked through this door. My friend told me this funny thing. People are drawn to the sensory details of the environment. We wanted to capture this analytically, so there's this my poor trainees, right? There's this like really extensive, difficult scoring paradigm that people use for autobiographical memory, but from it we can extract something called a perceptual bias of all the episodic memories you have, how much of them are oriented towards sensory details of the environment. And now we wanted to see, was this related to heart rate on a segment by segment basis? And indeed, you see that the more somebody's heart rate was going up in an individual segment of the haunted house, the more perceptual bias they had for that specific segment of the haunted house, right? So this was really exciting, but it also, on the other hand, just maps onto work we've known forever from like Elizabeth Loftus and Elizabeth Kensinger, that you get this trade-off. But what this gave us in this scenario, other than it being ecologically valid, was a way to understand the narratives of memory, right? Because when I was talking to my partner, how do we get to the point that I thought I was expressing a deep trauma that I just had? And he was like, how silly, right? Because there's something about these perceptual biases that mean more than just focusing on sensory details, but we actually thought it might be interfering with the way people are able to construct narratives about threatening events, right? And we hear the word a lot in trauma literature about memory fragmentation, right? But what does fragmentation mean? And we thought a lot in the lab about trying to figure out what memory fragmentation meant. And what we landed on, which was simultaneously brilliant and the most simple answer, was like, why don't we just ask people if these are fragmented or not, right? So we took all the transcripts from the haunted house, and then we posted them online, had people that were naive to the individuals that experienced it, never been to the haunted house. We had them listen to them, and we just asked them, how confusing was this, right? Like, if it is a fragmented memory, it should be more confusing. If it's unfragmented, you'll understand it, right? But what this allowed us to do was see what was happening with perceptual biases, and was that the underlying cause, or a underlying cause, leading to this disruption in our narratives of memory. So, just to keep things confusing for you also, rather than plotting it the way we would all assume I'd plot it, I'm plotting it in reverse as a comprehension rating. So that means the higher up you are on the y-axis, the better you understood it. If you're lower, the more confusing it was. The perceptual bias scale means if you're further to this direction, the more perceptual bias in the world, right? And what we saw in our first sample, where we just grabbed the extremes, was that the more perceptual biases there were, the more likely you were to find that memory narrative confusing. We then expanded this out to the whole sample of narratives that we got, and see this really strong, reliable, robust relationship that perceptual biases in some ways are underlying this sort of fragmentation of memories, or our inability to form them into cohesive narratives. Okay, how am I doing on time? Pretty good. Okay, so it seems like threat-related biases in perceptual memory result in more confusing memory narratives. So just as a summary, as we move through spaces, feelings of threat can dynamically shape what we extract from the world. And I really want to capture the dynamic part of this, right? This is as they were actually moving through these spaces. And it seems what threat is doing specifically is biasing us towards perceptual features of the world, which can fragment how we communicate memories to others, is what we showed, but also how we might communicate those memories to ourselves, which we haven't tested yet, but I think is a really exciting extension of this. I didn't want to bore you all with a bunch of computational free recall 1940s style paradigms that we've been doing, but what we've been finding, which I couldn't show here, is that one really core part of this narrative of how do we get from percept to a fragmented memory is time and temporal context. And what we see is that people are losing their ability to scaffold their memories over time, and this might be why they have a harder time constructing narratives, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A session. Okay, so in this last part, I just wanted to talk about some new ideas. These are rusty. All the other stuff I had it down. This is the part where we're getting a little Wild West for me, is these ideas of balancing threat and curiosity. And I want to go back to this idea. So I got home, yelled at my partner for being unsupportive. Then he apologized and understood. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm being really angry. I'm really upset right now. And I hadn't practiced meditation in a while. Like, it'd been maybe 6 months or so. And I was like, I'm going to go upstairs and just do a mindfulness practice because I am like very high arousal right now, and also like worried I'm going to get PTSD, and I don't want to get PTSD, right? So I went upstairs and practiced, and it was going through my head, and it was really salient. I was having a very hard time not attaching to the feelings in the moment, right? And then I remember from my course, the teacher said something like, oh, if you are having a hard time attaching it, why don't you try to start to be curious about how you're feeling, right? Like, oh, why is it that my heart rate feels like this against my chest? Like, give yourself an action to sort of work through that inability to not connect. And this idea of curiosity sort of having this interplay with threat in the moment and dampening the physiological arousal response, like, it feels intuitive, it feels real, there's sort of neuroscience data on it. Like when I was showing you those two plots, we know that threat sort of engages all these like norepinephrine systems. We know curiosity also engages these dopamine systems, which could then be a way to sort of dampen or balance between these two states. So these are our first attempts to start to scratch at the surface of this ebb and flow between these two systems. So I'm going to start with the downer moment first, and then we'll like end with a positive note. The downer moment was a study that we wanted to look at how threat influences curiosity. And this also partially stemmed from this idea that a lot of friend colleagues, we need a word that gets both of those in one, friend colleagues, were talking about was that when the pandemic started, a bunch of us noticed we stopped watching new television, right? Like all of a sudden everybody was watching Friends, right? Like these things that we've seen over and over again. And it sort of knocked on the door of this question. It's like, while we think like novelty is really good and curiosity is really good, it's this positive state, it's new information. And another thing we call new information with a label is uncertainty, which we consider aversive, right? So what's going on with this idea of how we enjoy curiosity and how that might be a function of sort of where we're at in the moment, embodying those goal states? So you all did an amazing job setting up how tortuous and up and down the pandemic was, right? So here's our version of our pandemic study where we tried to leverage the pandemic, is that my graduate student, Chen, in collaboration with Dave Smith, what she did was she found these stimuli of magic clips, and the magic clips were pre-rated by another group for being really high curiosity magic clips and really low curiosity magic clips. And what she did is she sampled people at 3 times during the pandemic, where we were like, you know, the ebbs and flows of uncertainty that are happening and threat was sort of varying wildly. So she sampled them 3 times, showed them high and low magic clips. After each magic clip, they made a rating of like, how much would you like to see more clips like this? So we can get a measure of hedonic value and enjoyment for each one of these. And then at the end of the session, we gave them this thing called the intolerance of uncertainty scale, which sort of mixes this idea of anxiety, uncertainty, and threat as a marker of where they were at in that moment. Then the next day, they came back and recalled as much information from the magic clips as they could. She is also a wizard and figured out how to use AI to just score all of our free recall data, which I'm happy to talk to people about if they're thinking about collecting free recall data, and it's hard to score it all by hand. So she found a way to automate it. So what did we find? Okay, the first thing, which had been shown already with these stimuli set, is that people remember high curiosity versus low curiosity magic clips better, right? And we really thought, okay, this is because people enjoy them, they're fun, that's why they're landing in. So then what we did in a mediation model was show that hedonic value, how much you like the clips, was really carrying a lot of weight in these memory enhancements, right? Not all of the weight, but carrying a lot of the weight in these memory enhancements. But the clutch question we want to know is, what is threat doing to this system, right? One option could be like, okay, you're like, I like this magic clip, but you're like, overall, you're still not encoding into memory because you're so distracted with all the world that's happening. So we wanted to look at this line between hedonic value and memory and see if threat influenced that. There was no relationship between those. Threat was not impacting the ability for value to get translated into memory, but rather where threat was really hitting the impact was that it was basically dissolving the connection between something that was curious to being something that you actually enjoyed. And in a related study, what we looked at was how surprising the videos were, and we found that when you were in a high threat situation, surprise was related as low valence, and when you were in a low threat situation, surprise was rated as high valence, right? So we're starting to unpack that sort of like the webs of threat can impair our ability to find joy or meaning or value out of these things that are surprising and sort of shape the interface in it. I think that's the downer moment. Now I'm gonna go for the happy moment that we're gonna end on, which is this also cued us to this idea that, oh, these are intrinsically related. So I gave an example where threat was sort of impeding on the ability to enjoy curiosity, but on the flip end of that then, we might be able to use curiosity to downweight the negative influence of threat. And this was actually an idea that was very much stirred by a shared graduate student, Joy Ham, who works with me and Chelsea Helian, who does emotion regulation for a living, and wanted to find more sort of naturalistic forms of emotion regulation to implement in the world. So Joy designed this awesome study, and I want to give them a lot of credit first that we started designing the study. We were like, Joy, use these IAP stimuli. And because that's what everybody does, and they're gorgeous, except we want your stimuli because they look nice or controlled. But this is what everybody does. But the problem is when you're thinking about curiosity, the IAPs, like, you have to work to put yourself into them, right? There's sort of an effort, or the motivational figure that Brandon was talking about, that it's sort of like, it's labile, right? And not everybody does it, not everybody's in it in a moment. Joy had this wonderful idea. He said, let's have people at the start of the study think of a peer and then say 9 things you're worried that peer would say about you, right? Adjectives that you're worried that they might judge you on. So this way we're getting really self-relevant threats, right? Then what Joy did is said, okay, imagine your peer described you as that, rate how you feel about it. Then we had 3 conditions, some classic emotion regulation things with reappraisal, where you decrease or increase the emotion you're feeling. And then we introduced the third one, which was just be curious about why they might say that about you, right? And then looked at the ratings responses after that. So what we found was that this curiosity emotion regulation technique was just as good a decrease at reducing your negative feelings about these words, right? So it was working just as effective as sort of these gold standard techniques that people use as cognitive reappraisal. But the exciting part is that at the end of the study, Joy asked how much effort did it take to follow this instruction? And what we found was that people found it so much less effortful than cognitive reappraisal to apply curiosity. So you're basically getting the same effect in negative decreases, but you're getting it easier. We're now starting to unpack the memory data to see what is it doing to your memory for these things. And I'm gonna take like a mild social justice moment here for a second, that Joy would have finished these analyses, but currently the graduate students at Temple are on strike. And in response, Temple has cut their health insurance, given them their tuition bill unexpectedly to their home, and they're still currently in really challenging negotiations. I'm theoretically not allowed to editorialize that point very much, but my graduate student Stephen is here, and he can editorialize for the both of us. So if you want to talk to him about it or hear more information, I invite you to talk to Stephen in the back. But that data is forthcoming, and we're going to start to see if it changes sort of the nature of the representations. Okay, so just as a summary, there seems to be this push and pull between curiosity and threat and their downstream influence on memory. And while threat might dampen our intrinsic curiosity in a moment, especially when we're maybe not aware that it is actually living in the background, we can harness curiosity techniques to try to dampen the effect of threat. So with that, I will leave these up as just some sort of broad take-home points that we got from this. But before that, I just want to thank all the people that worked on this and our funders, and then I'll clip back to this screen for questions and answers. Thanks. Oh, thank you. You see how much I'm sweating. I need to replenish.
Are we live here? Yes. Okay. Thank you. That was fabulous. First, we're going to take some questions for Dr. Murty. I invite folks here in the room to maybe offer up the first question while we get one queued up from the Zoom room also. Right here. Yes.
Is this?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I really thoroughly enjoyed your talk. My name is Sally, and I'm a second-year Ph.D. student from psychology. I'm curious about the population that you worked with these studies. So in our lab, we studied children, and I'm curious if we see similar trends, things like that. Thank you.
So these are all college-aged samples, or a little bit above. It was a community sample for the haunted house study, all undergraduates for the last two studies. One thing that's interesting that we haven't done yet is part of the motivation Chelsea and Joy have for the curiosity part is that these cognitive reappraisal techniques that people talk a lot about in cognitive neuroscience really heavily rely on executive function, which is probably not the ideal technique you want to give for a early childhood, late childhood, or potentially even adolescence, right? So one thing we're working on trying to get funding for is to take the curiosity work into an earlier sample. And then we've been thinking about some of the threat stuff in childhood, but then I am meditating on the ethics of how far we can go with something like the haunted house studies in early childhood. But the questions get really interesting because the hippocampus isn't fully developed in 4-year-olds, and it goes through rapid changes to 6-year-olds. So we're really interested in whether affect is then sort of even further putting you in a memory fragmentation space, which could help tether some ideas about early childhood trauma and memory and reactivation, because you sort of have two hits taking you away from this more contextualized representation, your age and the nature of the situation. But we're still trying to unpack where we feel comfortable looking at that space.
So,
Okay,
Thank
then
you.
we have one from the Zoom room.
Hi, great talk. I love that haunted house sort of manipulation and kind of testing people's memory for that. And the entire talk was great. And I don't say that just because Andy Orlenis was my advisor, but I did have a question on how you conceptualize the kind of states that people are in that there's a lot of individual differences. People can experience different extremes. And I'm curious about like kind of this predictive processing framework of, instead of people having like an overall goal state and it's like a singular state or goal that people have in mind, do you think people have in the same moment competing different goal states, and different neural subcircuits will be kind of competing depending on, you know, conscious goals, depending on some subconscious goals. So do you think there's some alignment, or do you think it's like a unitary state?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer with, wonderful question. Also really weird because I'm looking up at your giant head. So it like had more gravity than you might even know. I'm gonna talk about some data first and then answer what I think from some wild extrapolations from some animal data. So in the haunted house in particular, Chelsea, who does a lot of work in emotion theory, really was trying to capture the like mixed emotional states. Some people love it, some people think it's funny, and some people think it's horrible, right? The relationship between heart rate and emotion was particular for events that people labeled as negative, right? So the heart rate data wasn't picking up sort of positive feelings from it, but those positive feelings do exist, and we've yet to fully integrate, like we're writing our solo papers now and then working on sort of integrating these ideas of mixed emotional states to basically ask this question. But to speculate, and this is where the neuroscience really helps, which is a question I have to like look in the mirror and ask myself a lot, is like, what is the neuroscience actually giving us in any given moment? In the rodent literature, like let's use drug addiction, for example, you start off with a really high dopamine approach state of activation and curiosity and exploration, right? Then what can happen when you get into states of like craving after withdrawal, you still get at first activation of dopamine systems, but then if these stress systems in the LC co-activate, and they're laying on top of each other, which seems like a mixed emotional state, right? You have a want, but then you also have a lot of sort of threat that's around it. The outcome on memory and behavior is the LC wins, right? So the rats are more susceptible to freezing, they're more susceptible to rigid behavior. So it seems like while there might be a competition hitting under the hood of the surface, that threat circuit seems to dominate over the exploration circuit. And this is why you see a lot of like freezing behavior is prominent and will win in a lot of scenarios if that threat circuit is really high.
Okay, we have another question from the room, and I will invite you to name yourself and maybe say where you're from.
A very nice talk. I'm Uri, I'm from Princeton. I will be one of the speakers. When you say that curiosity really can help against threat, I was simply reading this morning a book from Primo Levi, The Periodic Table, and if you know Primo Levi, basically he was a chemist and he was also a Holocaust survivor, and the way that he dealt with the concentration camp is exactly by curiosity that helped him survive it. So I think it's a beautiful real-life example of this arrow that you can really use it against very severe threats.
Ori, we opened with a quote from him in our review paper on this topic. Like it is perfectly aligned and actually was a huge inspiration from Joy on this line of research. So that's like wonderful insight. And a like amazing book, like a really beautiful space where this exists. And now we're just trying to do the very, very boring lab versions of it to sort of reproduce the idea.
Do we have another from the Zoom? Nope.
Nope.
Okay.
So
and we
anyone-
have some more in the room here.
Hi there, my name is Caitlin Richards. I'm a second-year graduate student, and I'm studying marriage and family therapy. I was curious what the relationship was like between taking post-traumatic stress from a lens of curiosity, how that can be implemented in a therapeutic space. I know that's not typically your line of research, but I'm curious if you have any insight.
Oh, no, don't worry. I love to speculate on things that I have no business speculating on. Actually, Stephen, who's here, we started this line of work on sort of like retrieval goals a little bit. We're inching towards it, right? Like what happens when you give goals to share something more like a story versus more like a thing. So like, organize my thoughts before I start talking. Okay, so what I think is happening is in trauma work, there's this beautiful set of therapy on life narrative therapy, right? Where the idea is like, here's your life narrative, here's the traumatic event. And people will find that very distressing and have a hard time contextualizing it when these two things exist separately. A lot of the work is to basically pull in that traumatic event into your own life narrative, and then people tend to find less symptoms when they're able to embed it in there. So what I think is happening, and this gets to some of the stuff that Stephen and I have been thinking about, is if you shape people's goals and how they're thinking about what the utility of a memory is, potentially by curiosity, we might be, and now I'm stealing a lot of ideas and words from all the conversations we had yesterday, but like you might be giving them enough room or breadth to construct a narrative, even if they don't have the fundamental pieces of memory, but like, we're really good at scaffolding in things that we don't know necessarily. So what I could imagine is some balance that curiosity gives you the space to reconstruct a narrative off of the fragments that you do have, and in a way that isn't so predetermined by the parts of the memory that are coming up. Now that's like a lot of speculation, but we're trying to sort of lay down some of the blocks of like, can we use curiosity to help reconstruct fragmented memories, or what does it do when you're even experiencing threat to like be able to build a story around it, which I think could then relate to sort of therapeutic interventions in 30 years.
Okay, and then I thought I saw.
I have a question, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Cliff. Hi, I'm Janet Lawson from Autistry Studios. I work with teens and adults who are on the autism spectrum. And my question to you is, have you thought about what has impressed me about memory and autistics as a different reality and what they're looking, the context. So to try to make a judgment or a speculation about their creation of a narrative when their context and reality is quite different than you might be expecting. Have you thought about working with them in terms of with a neurodiverse population on what they find important and how they store that and retrieve it?
Yes, so not actually from my research. Okay, so my partner has autism and is in social work school. We've been talking about this a lot, and where I think he sent me some data that I don't have is that the rates of autism in the Dungeons and Dragons community is actually much higher, and a lot of neurodivergent populations are drawn to fantasy play in this sense. And there's something there about the freedom of a neurodiversity perspective in a world where the rules aren't so rigid that, now again, this is no data, this is just me and him talking about something while we're at home having dinner. But is this idea of like, can you use, and Dina Weisberg has a lot of beautiful work on this too, is like, can you use sort of fantasy storytelling to actually leave room to have more integration between neurodiverse and normative populations in a way that allows for that space? We're so far away from having the structure of understanding this, like, we're barely on the cusp of it, but I'm like, wildly obsessed with this idea, and also the idea of using narrative fiction as a lens to help neurodivergent populations sort of reconstruct a path that worked from them with the distance of fiction. A little bit too, where these like, I'm all over the place, but like I'm really excited about these ideas, but I haven't yet like turned them into a cogent thought, but like spot on 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
I really look forward to you
and
diving into it.
We should talk more, because I would love to talk.
The other thing is, real quickly, is how you tag something to store it in memory and what you use to retrieve it.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to take a moment here to pause and recognize that we had a break in the schedule right now for 10 minutes, and I'm going to invite you to take that break if you want it. And I'm also going to invite all our speakers here to take questions during that 10-minute period, because we skipped that section in our earlier session, and remind you that you will also have an opportunity during our discussion at the end of the panel to ask questions of everyone. So take the break if you need it. I'm going to invite my colleagues to come up here as well, and then I'm going to hand it over to Cliff to decide how the questions will come in. Because I will be up here.
So we missed the opportunity to ask questions of the first three speakers. And
I'm going to give the space to them.
okay, thank you so much, Deepa. That was just wonderful. So if we can rewind the moment, but first let's let the room settle. Each time we decided we'd make more space for discussion, the time for breaks got shorter. And so we then moved to the role of, you should take care of yourself as you need to, no matter what's happening in here or out there. You guys in Zoom land have a little easier on this front, I think. So there are some questions from the in-house audience here for our panelists from the first talk. Amishi.
Hi. Great work. And I have a question for you. Because of the burden, I'm using the word burden, because of the amount of effort and engagement it takes to set up a home lab, what kind of selection pressures are there of who decides to be in your study?
That is one of our major concerns, and why we are starting out rather than just sending it to everyone with a smaller pilot group. We were very concerned that we would get just immense dropout and lose all of our data by sending people this huge box, asking them to set it up. We've done a number of things to mitigate that, including video instructions for everything that really walk people through. But we're particularly concerned about older populations that are not as comfortable with technology. So the question is TBD, we'll see. We're making every effort we can to reduce the burden. But that's the major concern, like you nailed it, and major question that we're looking at right now as we start to pilot. It's like, okay, data quality, good enough. Participant self-selection and dropout, major concern. I think we're probably more optimistic than the average research group because we followed up with shamatha participants 7 years later and got really good response because the participants in the CCC study sent us their blood because we've been trained by Cliff. So Quinn might be able to speak to that too, but I wish I had we've already run it and 80% of people make it all the way through and they're similar to the people who dropped out, but we don't. We're figuring that out as we go.
I was just making the light-hearted joke that we've been trained by Cliff, so we are optimistic about field studies.
There are some things that are very interesting about this that go beyond the technology. In designing the home lab, you actually are asking a research participant to assume the mindset of an experimenter, independent of what the technical details are, and then asking them to then be a participant for themselves as their own experimenter. And in some sense, that's the story of my life and these guys' lives, but it's very discordant with the general population. And so I think I'm certainly mind blind to what it's actually going to be like in practice. But we do have this faith that there's a certain common senseness to it that can be articulated. We don't quite know how to do it right yet.
And a lot of beautiful instructional videos. And a lot of beautiful instructional videos. But it's, very different.
We hired a professional actress and videographer and voiceover artist who created scripts that I never in a million years could have written that actually really approach what it would be like for some non-technical person. And we have 8 produced videos with close-ups and a paragraph on the back of each one identifying what it is to be, how it is to be used.
And then we'll take one from the Zoom.
Thank you very much. My name is Nandini Chatterjee, and I come in from the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute in Delhi. I had 2 questions. One was, given the context that you were doing this during the pandemic, did you ever think of using images that were related to the pandemic? Okay, and if so, why did you choose 2 or choose against it, 1? And a second unrelated question, but which is sort of pertaining to what was asked earlier, is given that setting up sort of home labs is something that people are increasingly starting to do, and in a country like India, I'm not sure how you reward participants for participating in such studies. Do you think this could ever become a challenge where people take on the profession of becoming available as experimenters because they've set up a lab at home, and so that potentially makes them available to do these things for a number of lab studies because they get compensated for it? And this has happened in India in the past with RCTs, and it led to a very big challenge where our cities were shut down for a couple of years. So just your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so part of the picture set, the idea is that it's based thematically, and so we did include specific themes. We also wanted it to be up to date and relevant to the world, and so we have specific themes of COVID-related suffering. We also created a pleasant or positive theme of living in the pandemic, so people engaging from a distance, but in a happy way or in a positive way. So we included that. We have other themes like touching on protests in support of racial justice, themes of the Capitol insurrection and things like this. We haven't yet. I didn't really present data specifically on those themes, but we can and do plan to get into that breakdown on that level and to see on a thematic basis how people tend to approach or not approach that. I will say that some of our initial data shows that trying to come up with even pictures of people smiling, but they have masks or they have things that indicate the pandemic, really hard to pull for positivity. They're mixed affective states, which makes sense, but so that is something I can.
And to answer the second part of your question, participants in our study get paid for the time they spend setting up the lab. So we send them all of the equipment, and then that is part of the research or compensated time is the lab setup time. However, we had not had the thought of setting up kind of more permanent centers or locations that other people could go to someone else's home, and kind of a distributed network of labs. And I think that's a really interesting idea of kind of a balance between the two. I can see where IRBs would not love that. There would be a lot of logistical challenges more than just sending someone equipment. But I think it's an interesting question to ask. If we're saying, lab is not in a single specific physical location space, how do we make this both distributed and accessible? So yeah, I think a good question for us to think about as a research community.
I'm going to send Cliff out to rally our in-person crowd here for our next panel while we see if there's, not from Zoom.
That?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. And again, to be flexible when you're doing your project inside all the challenges. So it was nice to see your good humor and flexibility. I wanted to ask about the approach to suffering study. When you go to the emotional regulation literature, what you see there right now is that it's actually not about approach or avoidance, but more about understanding what is the right thing to do at every moment. Because when things are very, very challenging, actually sometimes taking a step back in order to regulate yourself and to get organized for approaching is actually the right thing, the more adaptive thing to do in terms of emotional health. And so I was wondering, if you can, how you address this, the fact that it's not always, either approach or avoidance, but sometimes it's a more complex dynamic.
So, yeah, I think that's a great question. A couple of things. One thing I didn't show in the data that we presented to kind of simplify it, I presented it as one dimension, but one thing is that they can indicate a degree of approach and a degree to avoid. And so we can look at the ambivalence of this or the mixed activation of that. I think there's a lot of interesting, they are static pictures, and so there is this question of what maps onto this potential stated impulse to approach and avoid an action in the world or action in the situation. There's a lot of factors at play there. One of the reasons we wanted to have this sort of harm category is also to these are really situations where one might be compelled to help, but there really is some thought and planning that would have to go into this because that might be counterproductive in a lot of ways or dangerous to yourself. So I think it's a great question.
Did we see a relationship with empathic distress?
So Alea was asking if we saw a relationship with another facet of empathy, which is personal distress or empathic distress, which relates to the tendency to get overwhelmed and distressed in the face of suffering. And we didn't actually see a relationship with that with any of the ratings. It was empathic concern that was relating to all the different kinds of ratings to the pictures.
Thank you. Yes, so now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Paul Condon. And we've had the opportunity to think a little bit about how to collect data remotely and in more embedded environments, how to think about different research paradigms that might be a little bit more realistic. And Paul's going to tell us a little bit about how we might disseminate these interventions via apps, and to help us think a little bit about the relational context of these practices also.
Okay, thank you everybody. So I was tasked with talking about app-based and remote-based training. So I'm going to share some data that speaks to the question of what it looks like when people train via an app, what the potential is there, but then I'm also going to offer a kind of view that could challenge that and potentially take it a step further and expand the potential efficacy of virtual-based training. And to begin, I would like to start by showing you some data that I collected actually when I was a graduate student, some of the first research that I got involved in the world of contemplative science. So this was a study. The question was, could we train people to increase compassionate behavior in response to 8 weeks of meditation training? And this was a study in which they met in person with a teacher. So I'm going to show you the data from that study and then show you what happens when we did the same study through an app. So after 8 weeks of training, people came to the lab and they thought that they would be doing tests of cognitive performance and attention. But the real test actually happened before they came into the lab. So this was a waiting room, and before the real participant showed up, we put 2 actresses, or what we sometimes call confederates, who were really working for me as the researcher, but they were just there in the public area, in the waiting area, taking the seats. And then the participant showed up and took the last remaining seat. And while they were waiting there, a third actress appeared using a pair of crutches and a walking boot. She sort of hobbled toward the bench and expressed some distress and some annoyance about having to stand. And everybody just waited. We waited to see what would the participant do. Would they give up their seat or not for the woman on crutches as a measure of a live pro-social behavior and a live social interaction? And we just waited and see what happened. So this is a classic phenomenon called the bystander effect, when people are not acting to help. When there are non-responsive bystanders, it tends to reduce helping behavior. And we did see that. For people who don't do any kind of meditation, very low rate of helping behavior, about 15%. But for people who did different kinds, including mindfulness and compassion meditations, the helping rate goes up pretty dramatically, about 50%. Now, admittedly, this is a small sample, and the control group is waitlist control, so it's not an ideal experimental design. But we did work to replicate this study using the same measure, same kind of procedure, but with mindfulness trained via an app. So what we find is a pretty good replication, actually. Again, very low rates of helping among a control group that used kind of like cognitive training games as their active control. But among people who engaged in 14 days of app-based mindfulness, we get an increase in prosocial behavior. Now, what's interesting, you'll see, is the effect size. The amount of the increase is somewhat less. So we saw about 50% helping rate in the face-to-face meditation group, but here it's about 35% among the people who got the mindfulness app. So I think this is a very simple point, but shows that we can replicate some of the effects that we would see of in-person training with a very accomplished, experienced teacher We can see some replication in the app. Now, what we don't know is the magnitude of the response. This is a dichotomous response, yes or no. Did they give up their seat? We don't know like how much of a compassionate response is being elicited by the training. We also don't know from this if the app or the in-person training will speak to different audiences more effectively. That's an open question. There have been a number of follow-up studies. This is older data from 2013 and 2015. Other studies from other people in the field have shown that apps can be effective for reducing stress, improving sleep, reducing anxiety, especially among vulnerable populations who may not be able to meet in an in-person, face-to-face class, such as cancer patients. The engagement with an app might be easier. We also see through meta-analyses that apps can be effective for reducing anxiety and depression among college students. So it appears to be a cost-effective way to engage and learn meditation. There are some limitations, though. You might not be surprised that in an app or virtual-based practices that dropout rates are higher than in-person studies. Also, dropout rates are even higher when people don't have contact with a researcher or an instructor or some person involved in the project. So there's something about a connection that does enhance or improve the engagement with the study. There's also some data that suggests people are more likely to stick with an app if they have higher existing levels of mindfulness. Yeah, I got some. Yeah, thank you. So there's another important point that I want to draw out from this research. This is a study from Michael Pollan, a social psychologist at SUNY Buffalo. They looked at what happens if we prime people to think about themselves in certain ways. So you prime people to think about themselves in a kind of personal, independent way by emphasizing pronouns like I and me in a priming task. Other people were primed to think about themselves in a more interdependent way by focusing on pronouns like we and ours. And interestingly, that very simple prime shaped the way people then engaged with a virtual mindfulness-based experience. So you can see on the left there, the independent mindset of mindfulness actually reduced people's willingness to volunteer and provide help to researchers. So the meditation is actually making them more selfish. In contrast, the people who are primed to think about we and ours, the meditation increased their willingness to engage in pro-social behavior. So there's something very important, and it's just, in this case, just a very simple priming exercise, but there's something very important about the relational atmosphere or context that shapes how meditation impacts behavior. So this was a quote from one of our academic ancestors in contemplative science. Francisco Varela said that practices undertaken simply as self-improvement schemes will only strengthen the very egotism that they are intended to dispel. And I think we risk that somewhat with virtual and app-based practices, that they could potentially reinforce a kind of autonomous or independent mindset that we might bring. Without really knowing it, we might bring that into contemplative practice. So there's some research that suggests there's some relational elements that can enhance meditation. And this is something I'm looking at with one of my students, Alea Skwara, who's here. And so we're just starting to think about this, but some research suggests that in-person training yields greater trust in the instructor, in the classmates, and in the self. And I think that's likely going to have huge effects on how contemplative practice shapes people's behavior, capacity for compassion. But there's some research, again, that suggests contact with researcher or instructor can increase adherence and satisfaction and engagement with an app. Some research suggests that for people who are going through cancer and who are prescribed to use mindfulness apps to support their treatment, when they have a caregiver who also participates in the app with them, alongside them, it increases their ability to stay with the practice and get some benefit out of it. Something about that sense of social support enhances the mindfulness practice. So So all of this, for me, speaks to something very important, a sort of broader picture that we could be thinking about that I think is relevant not only for app-based meditation, but just meditation in general. That there's something about this idea of a relational mindset for meditation that is very important. And before I talk about what I mean by a relational mindset, I need to back up a little bit and give you a little bit of history about how we've really incorporated a kind of independent or individualistic mindset into meditation without really being aware of it. It's just something that sort of is so pervasive in our culture that we don't even notice it. And this has been made most apparent, I think, through the work of a Buddhist studies scholar, historian, David McMahon, wrote a very wonderful book called The Making of Buddhist Modernism. It really changed my whole view and perception of this world and this research. So he talks about how the meditation practices that we see in the modern West in particular are a very novel construction, a new kind of Buddhism that is in many ways unrecognizable with earlier sort of traditional forms of Buddhism. In particular, because of the forces of European Enlightenment, Renaissance, colonialism, the meditation that has been transported into our culture has been adapted through a lens of individualism. And that gives rise to a more independent, self-help mindset for meditation, as if it's my practice and it's my individual effort and my individual discipline that's helping me to become more mindful and more wise and more loving. So McMahon says that, he puts it this way, that people conditioned by Western modernity tend to hold an anthropological view of people or persons as possessing distinct identities ontologically prior to social groups and relations. So it's like we're atomistic things that are just kind of floating around on our own, and we choose whether or not to enter into relationship. So this is two different ways, a kind of modernistic European Enlightenment view of the person, this independent mindset as an individual, versus the view of the person as embedded in relationships, embedded in a lineage of relationships and community and history of interpersonal connection. So we could see how just right away those two mindsets would dramatically impact how we might see contemplative practice and how we might engage in it. If we take another step back now and sort of step outside of the view of contemplative science and meditation research, but just look at research on compassion from a developmental and social psychology lens, it's really apparent that this independent mindset or independent approach is going to cause some problems in our efforts to cultivate compassion. We know from many areas of data that relationality and support is very important for compassion. And there's a number of barriers that we see in the literature that come up when people don't have a strong sense of social support. So lack of a secure base, coming from a developmental attachment perspective, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. A sense of aversion to suffering. When people are in organizations where they don't have a sense of social support, connection with other employees, and support from their organization, they're more likely to experience burnout, an aversion to other suffering. A sense of feeling alone in suffering and feeling alone in our own suffering. We tend to experience our own distress or anxieties as something that separates us from other people, as opposed to a resource that might lead us to a sort of common human experience and solidarity with others. And then also a kind of reductive impression of others, a kind of stereotyping or bias, or just a kind of impression of another person as a means for some instrumental end, as opposed to other beings as sort of a deeper human potential and deeper worth. So these are all barriers to more sustainable, inclusive compassion that become apparent when we look at data in social psychology and developmental psychology when people have a lack of relational support. We also know that people have innate capacities for care. people through evolution are prepared to come into the world with the capacity for social connection and caring relationships and collaboration. So this is, again, apparent from developmental psychology. It's also apparent from cultural anthropology and on communal caregiving. Also very much relevant in health psychology, where we see that social support is really important for people's ability to maintain health behaviors. So I want to hone in a bit on this idea of security, the idea of a secure base that comes out of attachment theory. A feeling of security, and most often this is thought about as something that's cultivated in infancy with early caregivers, but it's also something that can be shifted over the lifespan. So even if we don't have a perfectly secure relationship with our parents, or if we've had difficult or even neglectful or abusive relationships, there's still room for security to be enhanced over the lifespan. And here, this is particularly influenced by work by Mario Mikulincer and Phil Shaver. Phil Shaver is a professor here at UC Davis. Here are some of the features of feeling secure: safety, protected, less reliance on defensive strategies, mental resources for care, exploration, affiliation, taking calculated risks, accepting challenges, broadening perspectives, and pursuing self-actualization. And Mikulincer and Shaver have developed a really rich body of literature called security priming or attachment priming that can temporarily increase all of these capacities, even for people who've had primarily insecure attachment orientations throughout their life. So just for a moment, people can experience these things, and that can then help overcome all of those barriers to compassion that I just described. So simply calling to mind the idea of security or felt connections with certain people or images or feelings that help connote that sense of safety and security can help overcome all those barriers. So here's some examples. These are coming from the attachment priming or security priming literature. And this is for like maybe 10 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. There's various ways of doing this, but just for a moment, people are then able to experience less reactivity to emotional threat, greater resistance to empathy fatigue. So we know that if there's an identifiable victim, like a single person who's experiencing distress, it might be relatively easy for us to experience compassion and approach them and offer help. But as we become exposed to more and more and more people who are suffering, our tendency is to shut down the emotional response, to avoid engaging. But this security priming counteracts that. It helps resist that tendency. We can stay present with suffering. Greater patience listening to others, reduced cardiovascular reactivity to stress, reduced pain-related neural reactivity, reduced prejudice and hostility, and reduced dehumanization towards outgroups. Again, just 1 or 2 minutes of security priming leads to these effects. So what's exciting about this is there's a potential here to take it further, to incorporate that security priming, this relational mindset, into contemplative practice. We call this recovering a relational mindset to actually build a secure base. This can help repeat the experience of having a secure base and strengthen that. So again, it's not that we're assuming that people come into the practice with a secure base already in place, but the very point of the contemplative practice can be to help people experience a secure base and then strengthen it. And by doing so, people can establish a kind of inner safety to become present to their emotions, to their own emotions and their own experiences, and then extend that sense of safety and security to others. And this is inherently relational, so it's not a kind of autonomous self-generation of care, but a sense that if we can experience what it's like to be seen through others' eyes of care, if we can experience what that's like, that helps establish a kind of inner security to see others and support others in the same way. So my collaborator and I, John McCransky, have coined this and talked about this as the relational starting point for meditation. So relational mindset, relational starting point. The assumption is not that we're trying to cultivate compassion, empathy, wisdom on our own, but we're actually starting with a sense that we are embedded in care, an ecology of care that includes support from many others. So here's a few ways that one could do this. We call this a field of care, and this can be done within a secular application. And for those of you who have connections to various contemplative traditions or Buddhist traditions or other religions like Christianity, contemplative Islam, Judaism, many indigenous spiritualities throughout the world, you might feel a sense of connection to a spiritual figure that you could call to mind for doing a practice like this. But it could also just be a simple moment of caring connection, maybe a memory with some friend or family member at some point in your life. So I sometimes share an example of playing cards with my grandma in her kitchen when I was 6 or 7. Not the whole relationship, but just that one particular memory of playing cards. It might be a benefactor, so somebody who's had a very important role in your life in some way and has been a mentor or inspired you. Or it could be somebody who you've never met, but their work and their way of being in the world has been of benefit or uplifting to you. It could also be a special place, somewhere out in the world that feels welcoming to call to mind. A moment when you were the loving presence to another. So oftentimes it feels this way when I'm just playing with my 3-year-old daughter. You know, I'm the one who's the so-called adult and the caregiver in that moment, but just something about being with her is like that. It helps evoke that same kind of feeling or capacity as the memory with my grandma. It could also be something more general, like a piece of artwork or music or poem. It doesn't have to necessarily be a person, it could be a pet. Something that just evokes a sense of joy and happiness. If you feel that, that's a sign that it could work. And maybe just by describing some of these options, you're already potentially starting to feel that. It's a feature of how our minds work, that by simulating memories of experiences or people, we can actually re-experience it here in the moment. And the contemplative practice can really take advantage of that. So I'd like to try this, if you're all willing, just to try a little practice here to wrap up this presentation. And so what I recommend is choose one of those options. Sometimes the mind will be like really racing through and exploring a lot of different possibilities, which is a good thing to explore. But for this session, for our first time, just pick one option. And we'll just, in the instructions of the meditation, we'll try to bring that to mind as if that person or being or that moment is actually happening here now. So feel free to just take a moment to sort of relax into a comfortable position. And take a moment to come down from the thinking mind. We've been doing a lot of hard thinking already this morning. So just settle into the felt experience of the body. Feeling the connection with the chair or the floor beneath you. And feeling the support of the space around you and above you. Feeling the support of the breath, wherever that's most salient to you. And now bring to mind your field of care, a simple caring moment or benefactor or spiritual being. And bring that to mind not as a distant memory, but as if it's here now. And you are being held in warmth and care and wisdom. You're being seen in your basic goodness and potential beyond any fleeting judgment or narrative. And then notice the qualities, the sort of caring energy and quality that comes with this experience. Maybe a sense of ease or calm. Just noticing however it is for you. And then explore relaxing into those qualities more deeply. Letting them infuse your whole being and body and world. And if the mind gets rigid or distracted, you can just take a break for a moment, and then when you're ready, freshly call to mind your field of care again, as if it's here. And then if you wish, you could call to mind somebody who you'd like to include in this field of care. Maybe somebody you'd like to extend that caring energy out to. Call them to mind and allow them to be included here as well. Wishing them well and sensing them in their goodness. And then we can just let the imagery or visualization gently dissolve, but allow the warmth and care and energy to continue, helping the mind to just gently relax and fall open. And just letting the natural openness help the mind relax. Okay, so we don't need to make a big deal about the end. We can just kind of come back. So just sort of one thing to close, a question I think to kind of pose. There was a moment in the meditation where I instructed you to notice the caring energy or quality that's arising, and I named a couple, like calm and ease. But it'd be helpful if we could hear from the group, what did you notice in just a brief phrase or two? And if people wanted to just name it, I could speak it back out so it gets into the mic. So just a phrase or two, can you name one or two loving qualities that you noticed? And I also invite in the chat, people could add just a chat phrase or two of loving energies or qualities that you noticed.
Paul's going to repeat some of those back, and we're looking at the ones in the chat here. So.
Yep, so just inviting people on Zoom to name one or two loving energies or qualities that you noticed.
We can vocalize some in the room too. I heard warm.
I heard warm. Unconditionality. Gratitude. My hips relaxed. Relaxed. Body relaxed. Comfort. Spaciousness, quiet. Selflessness. Respect. Enveloped. Great. I can't see what's going on up there on Zoom, but you all can see it, so that's what's important. So the purpose of the practice is not so much to worry about the content of the meditation, actually. And the more that, if somebody were to do the practice and explore a lot of different kinds of ways of filling in the contents of the meditation, there can be a discovery that there's greater confidence or trust in being able to experience these qualities. It's something innate. It's not like they're coming into the room and giving us something, but rather we're using the vision and imagery to help access and evoke something from within, and then through the practice, stabilizing it. I think from Deepu's presentation, I'm really inspired by ways in which we were sort of actually potentially reconnecting with memories, and through the practice that's becoming less fragmented, possibly. So potential to explore. I'll give you one last example to kind of help draw out this point that the practice is helping evoke something from within that can be potentially trustworthy as a basis of security. So during the peak of the pandemic, I had a very young daughter. She was about 9 months old at that time. And my wife and I were struggling, just trying to maintain our lives and our work and things. It was just very stressful. And I would take my daughter to this pond every day. It was just a few blocks from where we lived. So we go to the pond every day, and this became a very important resource for us as a kind of field of care out in the world. And then one day, this was in September of 2020, I live in Southern Oregon, there was a huge fire. About 2,000 buildings were destroyed. And the Ashland Pond, the pond where we go, was also, you can see, was impacted by that. So it's not quite what it was before. But then I was in a session where somebody was leading this meditation, and I just called to mind the experience of being there in the pond. And there's something about, even though there was grief and loss over what happened, actually the being able to connect with it within the meditation made it like more powerful. It became indestructible because there's the memory there that's helping us to connect with something internal. So it's not a kind of external thing that we need. It's helping us connect with an internal resource. So I think that this is something that could be adapted into a virtual space and done effectively. I don't think it needs to be only done in person. It's a potential kind of practice that can be done in a virtual space. And we can recover this relational aspect of practice that has been traditionally a resource in many contemplative traditions. So I will stop there, and we have time for questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. One of the things that is occurring to me, having looked at our picture set and the social, non-social distinction. All right, you can't see me in the dark over here. Okay, but now I can't see you because there's lights in my eyes. So the social and non-social distinction and what you just ended with makes me think it's worth shifting our language and our thought toward relational rather than maybe social. Because especially those natural scenes, those are beings, those are, trees, plants that we are in relationship with, and to broaden our sense of resource and relationality. And with that, I will open it to the room, Zoom and in person. Yes, back here. Cliff, you're our mic runner.
Paul, thank you for that. I was really struck with a parallel to a practice. I work with musicians on mindfulness and contemplative practices. And one of the practices that we have is essentially calling forward a person in a musician's life who is somebody they feel grateful for or evokes a really strong response. And the protocol is essentially, we do this in a class, they'll call that person to mind. And we're doing some pilot studying just to see how those individuals feel under different conditions. One, a high selfing condition where they're just thinking about themselves, which musicians typically do because they're monitoring for errors. And one when they're other-oriented or... And so we have them do this, and what's fascinating is that not only do the individuals that do these kind of practices, sort of that field of care, feel different, the perception from the group of musicians in the room about the performances are always much higher on the end when they do the relational practice. So I just wanted to share that. I thought that is something we've been experimenting with, and when you brought that up today, it made me think about that. So thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
Cool. Yeah.
And what's your name?
Frank Diaz, Indiana University. I made me Miss Oregon too, by the way. I used to teach in Eugene.
Cool.
So.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more, or just connect and talk more about that. But yeah, I forgot to share the example, but I think also an activity that helps us to feel a kind of connection could be a field of care, like playing a musical instrument. For somebody who has a relationship with it, that itself could be the field of care, because it's helping evoke the qualities of openness and joy. So the musical instrument can be the way of doing it. But there's also then the relationship to the teachers who helped inspire that too.
Okay. We've got one from Zoom, and then I want to take one here.
Yes. Karen Durham asks, have you ever studied the effects of group prayer and church attendance as relates to engagement/empathy?
I haven't personally studied that. It's a great question. I know there's some research that's kind of in the works. Jim Cohn at UVA, who studies social baseline theory, his work really aligns with this perspective and would add some rationale to that perspective, that question, that if we're doing something in a social context with others, that it's providing a kind of energetic support, so the body and brain are less reactive to threat, and it potentially could enhance the practice. And I mean, in terms of the distinction between a virtual space and an in-person space, like obviously we can feel collective energy in a physical space and in proximity to people, and then there's also the benefit of the setting and the atmosphere, like in a retreat space. But I think we can to some extent replicate some of those things through hybrid or virtual space, like even like the setup of what we're doing right now, like we're connected, we're talking to each other, sharing experience. That is a kind of field of care that we're all generating together to support practice.
Did you have a question? Yeah.
Let's see if it's on. Okay. Hi, Paul. My name is Kiana, and I'm from UC Santa Barbara. I'm super happy to be here with all of you. That was a very nice meditation that you led. So my question is, if not self-help, what sorts of experiences or exposures or beliefs you think can facilitate interest in contemplative practices? Because in modern American society, but just like generally everywhere, that self-help mindset seems to be the thing that draws most people in. And I was wondering if you think that there's other exposures to interest in the nature of mind in a less self-help based way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the self-help thing is inherently problematic. It could be that a person first engages with an app and does mindfulness-based practices, and then that leads to interest in a deeper exploration. That's how it was for me. So I think that for many of us, that's how we learn, and that's what part of what David McMahon's point in Buddhist modernism is, that many of us are first engaging in meditation through that way, which is very new kind of way of engaging with meditation or learning it. But I think that that point that I shared earlier about the in-person group creating a sense of trust with a teacher, trust with classmates, trust with self, that seems to me really important for helping people take contemplative practice deeper beyond, people tend to drop out after doing an app for 10 days or 8 days. That sense of connection and trust and dynamic feedback with instructors could really provide support. So I think that's part of the answer to the question, is a sense of social engagement with other people who are supporting, whether it's a teacher or whether it's a kind of community or sangha of other practitioners.
Okay, we've got one more from the Zoom room.
All right, hi, it's David Cresswell from Carnegie Mellon University. And thanks for the talk. I'm thinking about this slide you left us with around populating a sense of relationality in the context of these contemplative practices. And when I think about relationships, I think about relationships with others, but also with myself. And, I'm wondering, you framed a lot of your work around attachment security. We've done a lot of work with self-affirmation theory. I wonder if you've thought about looking at self-affirmation or value affirmation, thinking about things that you really value as sort of another approach that may even perhaps better capture this broader sense of relationality that we want to really harness to help people.
Yeah, so this idea of affirming things that are particularly important to us as a way of supporting our engagement with contemplative practice. I think that likely the way that I would put the two together is that they're not necessarily separate, like the sense of relationality and the sense of independence or self-determination theory kind of perspective. Like relationality and autonomy can actually be very much supportive and integrative. And one way of defining security is not like someone who is perfectly and totally emotionally independent, but actually somebody who is comfortable navigating between stages of being in relationship and being autonomous. So I think when I present this work and talk about it, I think oftentimes there's this potential perception that we're saying sort of autonomy and independence is not valued within the perspective, but it's not to favor one or the other. It's just that the individualism and sort of self-help kind of approach has been emphasized, and that if we bring in the relational piece, it could help deepen it and make it potentially richer. So yeah, I think the autonomy and the relationality piece are important.
Excellent. So I know we have many more questions, but it is lunchtime. And so I think we're going to abbreviate the panel here and invite you to eat lunch on time. And hopefully that will keep the rest of the day closer to on time. But I also encourage you to take your questions into lunch and into discussions. And we will meet back here in 1 hour.